Oh my gosh, it's Joan's room.
Joan Lewis is one of the most well-known and loved reporters covering the Vatican in Rome.
Welcome to wonderful, beautiful, unique St. Peter's Square.
For over 40 years, she has covered 4 popes, working directly with the Vatican, with the New York Times, and now for over 20 years with EWTN, witnessing history on so many occasions and sharing it with millions of people around the world.
Voting is scheduled, we don't know for how long because we don't know what ballot they'll pick a pope on.
And as well as reporting on day-to-day Vatican events, for years Joan also presented her own popular show on EWTN, Joan's Rome.
As you can see, we're standing in front of the Paul VI Hall,
where she would bring viewers to some of her favourite spots in the Eternal City. And in this one-on-one interview in her home just beside the Vatican, we learn about the woman behind the person we see on TV, and how growing up in Illinois in the USA, even from a young age, faith was important.
The idea of not going to Mass, no matter where I was in the world, that didn't even occur to me.
Did you think of the Sisterhood?
I did.
We talk about the good times.
And I can't tell you the conversation.
If the walls could speak.
Oh yes, if I ever wrote a book on my dinner parties, that's what the title would be, If the Walls Could Speak.
And the more difficult times too.
There's always the sun's going to rise the next day. There is a next day.
And she tells me the secret to her vitality and love for what she does.
PhD is passion, hard work, and dreams. And if you really want to go through life, you have to have your own PhD.
I'm Colm Flynn, and this is an interview with Joan Lewis. Well, it's not often you get to sit with true Roman royalty, but that is what I'm doing today. Joan Lewis, thank you so much for having us in your home.
I am beyond blessed and delighted. Thank you.
Now, we've just seen on screen a very quick whiz through your incredible career, stretching 4 decades now?
4 decades, 40 plus years.
Wow. Working for the Vatican, connected with the Vatican, reporting on the Vatican, and we're going to get into some of those highlights in just a moment. But I think for many of our viewers and listeners, you'll be most well known for Joan's Rome. So I want to start by asking you, Joan's Rome, what would be your idea of a perfect day in Rome, in Joan's Rome?
I'll take 2 days because I'll take a work day and then a day off, because those would be very, very different. A work day could be very easily going out and interviewing some of the fascinating scores, maybe hundreds of people that I've interviewed over the years, especially for my radio show, Vatican Insider. And then coming home, what I loved about doing an interview, I come home, I listen to the tape and I edit it, and I relive that moment with the person. Whether we met in their office, sometimes they come to my home. And then covering a story, keeping up with the news of the day, a papal event, and just going to bed thrilled that I am in the Eternal City and I'm doing what I think for decades I felt is the Lord's work for me. Then on a day off, oh my gosh, that can be anything. a day off, there's so many beautiful sights in Rome, and it can be sitting in Piazza Navona having a lunch, or just going in the morning having a coffee and reading an electronic newspaper, sitting outside of buildings that are, date from the 1500s. So many beautiful things to do, and there's 500 churches in Rome. So you can visit a church a day for a couple of years.
How many of those 500 do you think you've been to?
That's a good question, because when I first moved to Rome, I decided I would visit one church at least a week. And probably for a year or two, I did that. And then it just kind of fell off, other activities. But the overall answer would probably be 60 or 70.
Okay.
That's not too bad.
That's not too bad at all. When people first come to Rome, of course, they have that awe and wonder in their eyes as they take in everything around them. 4 decades on, you've been back and forth to Rome a few times, back to the States and stuff. But
sure.
Do you still have that sense of awe and wonder when you walk around?
Absolutely. I surprise myself sometimes. The fact that I can walk, my house is 4.5, 5 minutes from St. Peter's Square, that I can walk down past these ancient, walls of Vatican City. And of course, what you can't what we can't see today on our film. I'm looking straight out the window at the Dome of St. Peter's.
Isn't it incredible?
So that is wonderful, and I've never taken that for granted. When I go to bed at night, I look out the window, and that's the church for me. And the table I am seated next to when I'm watching TV or reading has a picture of my parents and of Pope John Paul. So I have faith and family surrounding me all the time.
Faith, family, memories, tradition.
Oh my gosh.
And as you mentioned, we're sitting here in your beautiful house. This is incredible, and you've been so kind to bring us all in, myself and the crew. And as you said, we can see St. Peter's Basilica just out the window. I know you've had many people come and go here over the years and in the other places you lived. So before we get into that, let's go back in time, back to the United States of America and to just outside Chicago. You were
a suburb of Chicago, Oak Park, Illinois, indeed. Yeah.
And you were born into a very religious family?
Very, very religious, and especially my grandparents on both sides of the family, in particular, I guess on my dad's, very philanthropic. You will find the Lewis name on many buildings and hospitals and universities in the United States. So the idea of being part of a church family, of your parish on the local level, and then bigger things, being part of the diocese, growing up as a teenager in my 20s, becoming involved in church affairs, fundraising for the poor or something. So
a well-to-do family?
Yes, I think when we were growing up, we knew my grandparents were wealthy. We knew that we always had to ask Mom and Dad twice for something we may have wanted. We were not given, we had to work sometimes, even with our little allowance and everything to get, and that's good. My parents taught us the value of money, and it didn't grow in any tree in our backyard, so that if we wanted a new bike, what do you mean? You have the old bike and it works fine.
When we met before in your favorite coffee shop, you were telling me about a great saying one of them had to do with philanthropy and why it was important, if you're blessed with having wealth, to also give back.
No, my great uncle Frank said he had a partnership with the Lord. And I actually never knew this until one day I was leaving my Vatican office going home, and I was walking by a bookstore near the Vatican, a newspaper stand, and there was a nun trying to get her point across. The man didn't understand. I said, "Sister, can I help you?" Obviously American. And she said yes and told me what she wanted. We got the transaction, and she said, "Your English is so good." And I said, "Oh, sister, I'm American. I'm from Chicago." "Oh my gosh, so am I. What are you doing here?" "I work for the Vatican. What's your name, etc.? Is it on your articles that you write?" And so when I said Joan Lewis, out of the blue, she said, "Are you any relation to the Lewis family of Chicago?" And Frank Lewis, and I said, "Yes." Oh my gosh. She was a teacher at a Catholic school, and she began every school year with the new students by telling them, there's this wonderful man in Chicago, a philanthropist, and he has a saying, "I have a partnership with the Lord." The Lord gave him his brains, the wherewithal to make his money and fortune, etc. And he had an obligation, a partnership, to give back to the Lord.
What was the family business? What were you involved in?
And he was in real estate for many years. My grandfather, his brother, was, he owned Lewis Tar Products. They made, tar was then the big thing for paving roads and for roofs. And they were actually, in the Second World War, they were a war industry. So my father worked instead of going overseas, my father, worked for him.
So, Lewis, Joan, when you were a teenager growing up in the States, what time would this have been at?
A teenager in teenager 50s, late 50s, yeah.
And young Joan Lewis in the fun 50s, what were you interested in? Or were you thinking of getting into family business or family affairs, or did you want to study something else? Or what was kind of your spark?
I loved geography. I loved languages. And I definitely wanted something to do with languages. So I did end up majoring in high school and college in French, and I had a minor in political science. I actually, at one point, kind of thought of the diplomatic corps. And as a matter of fact, my senior year in college, I took the very difficult exam from the State Department. I passed the language part with flying colors, and I missed the overall grading by 1 point, which really stunned me because I was competing with people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s whose entire life was doctorate degrees in foreign studies, etc. And here I was, just a senior in college. So the exam only was given once a year, so I didn't take it again. But that's what I thought of.
So you knew that you wanted to work maybe abroad somewhere?
Oh yes, and my junior
year
in college was abroad too.
And did your faith waver? You know, with young people and they're going through university and they're hanging out with their friends, sometimes the faith can kind of go to the side because their interests are taken up elsewhere. What was your faith like as a young person growing up?
Never wavered.
Never?
Never wavered. And I'm not, sugarcoating anything. It was important for me.
Yeah.
The idea of not going to Mass, no matter where I was in the world, that didn't even occur to me. And at the university, for heaven's sakes, I went to St. Mary's of Notre Dame, a college university. We had Masses several times a day. My sophomore year, I was in Regina Hall, a very small hall. There were like only 20 or 30 of us that lived on the 2 floors. Right outside my bedroom door was our beautiful chapel. I was the sacristan for a year, and I had to know Latin for that. I loved that. Daily rosaries. Everybody I knew was a person of faith.
When I hear you talk about your love for daily rosary, going into the church every day, did you think of the Sisterhood?
I did. And I remember asking a nun whom I just adored in my freshman year at St. Mary's. I went up to her one day and asked how she knew she had a vocation. And she smiled back and she said, "Are you asking because you think you might have one?" And this was towards the end of the year, and I had gotten to know her. And I said, it occurred to me from time to time, sister. And you know what her advice was? She told me, she said, "Joan," she said, "date, enjoy college, travel." She said, "If you have dreams and everything," she said, "live out those dreams and those desires and those plans and so forth. And if you still feel a calling, that will end up being stronger." And she said, that's exactly what I did, and for me, the calling was stronger. Well, of course, as we sit here, we can see that, the calling for me, the Lord wanted me where I am now. He wanted me, actually, for many years, I was a French teacher. But I always loved writing. I always loved telling stories, journalism. He put me on that path very, very gradually.
So how did Joan get from the United States then across the pond and into Europe? Because I know you traveled a bit.
Yeah. Well, when I was here in my junior year in college, I fell in love with Italy. I was studying in Switzerland. We traveled all over Europe, but we came to Rome. And we were here, it was March, it wasn't even beautiful weather.
Just to visit while you were studying in Switzerland?
Oh, yes. And I just knew, and then we saw a Pope. The first Pope in whose presence I ever was John the 23rd. And there was no audience hall at the time. But in fact, there were no regular Wednesday audiences. So the Pope, when he would receive people, just a couple hundred, it was in the Hall of Blessings, which is that big, long, beautiful hall above the atrium of St. Peter's Basilica, where the balconies are that, the Pope appears on when he's elected. And that was just like another reason to come back. The Vatican and the Pope, the head of the Universal Catholic Church, And then one day, another nun friend from St. Mary's, we had stayed in touch, and Sister Miriam Ann wrote, and she said, "Joan, you didn't hear this from me, but St. Mary's has now a program in Rome, and I know that for the next academic year they have an opening. Why don't you apply?" And so actually that's how the door opened to my life in Italy.
And then when you moved here, I presume you were making the connections. I know you were translating some thesis for a certain for a cardinal or for different priests.
For priests studying at the North American College at the graduate level. They were already ordained. I had gotten in touch with a number of them, and they needed somebody to type their theses, and I'm saying type as in typewriter. Oh yeah, right. And if you made a mistake, you had to pull out all the carbon paper and everything else and kind of start over. But I think that gave me an in-depth look at even telling a story. getting behind the scenes. It's not always that easy. There's a lot of research. And my middle name is Truth, so it's truth and facts. So there's a lot of work in there.
They say when you work in this business that you are bitten by the bug. So when did the bug first creep up for media, for writing, for broadcasting, and when did it bite you?
Oh, I mean, that bit me when I was in college. And I remember my junior year when I came overseas, my dad gave me, I have no idea where he got it, he gave me 1,000 sheets of a very, very fine paper. It was a light pink color. Because you wrote letters then. There was no other way to be in touch. So I would write single 8 by 11 page, single spaced, 4 pages. I would write letters 4 and 5 times a year, very often to my family, but 4 and 5 times a year to my grandparents, aunts, and uncles. So I wrote the letter, and I'd have the carbon paper, and I'd have 3 or 4 copies. And those were my stories.
They were your stories. So that was your first journalism to your family.
Oh yeah, and and where we'd been, and I mean the history, and who was, and Michelangelo's David and Michelangelo's Pietà and things. And my mom put all of those in a scrapbook. Boy, talk about one of the most amazing books I'll ever own. But then how I got, into journalism when I actually, Mother Seton, her canonization in September of 1975 was an event that opened all the doors for me, because a priest who was coming to Rome wrote another priest friend of his here. Father Dervin was the official biographer of Mother Seton. And so he was going to come to Rome and open a kind of a PR office for a month, a couple weeks before and a couple weeks after the canonization, September 15th. And Father in the U.S. asked his priest friend here, give me a seminarian who can help me out in the office. And Father Wrench wrote back and he says, no. He said, you're going to have cocktail parties, you're going to receive visitors, you have to have someone who really knows Rome, and that's Joan Lewis. And so Father and I became very close friends. I got to know a lot of people in the Vatican. One of the persons I got to know was Cardinal John Wright. He had a great love of St. Joan of Arc, and if your name was Joan, you already walked on water.
You were in.
Yeah, you were in. And I have a beautiful medal that he had minted with his coat of arms on one side and St. Joan on the other. And he asked me to be his secretary on weekends. And then one of the men who came to interview Father Dervin for the during the period of the canonization, Al Schuster, was the brand new bureau chief of the New York Times, and Jewish, and he absolutely was fascinated by the Catholic Church, because now the Vatican was going to be part of his beat. Al was, when he learned that I was available, he offered me a full-time job at the New York Times.
Which you took.
Which I took, and it was fabulous newspaper. Oh my gosh, the newspaper was flown in every single day for us. So it would go to press at midnight or whatever in New York, we'd have it in the morning.
What was it like covering the Vatican for the New York Times back then? I know that some people say today there's kind of an anti-church bias across mainstream print media and broadcast media, but back then...
What I loved about Al, he had lived abroad, and his kids had lived abroad all of their lives. And he'd been in, he was in London, I think, before they came to Rome. But in any event, he had this world perspective, obviously. He's in Rome, a major capital city, but also now covering the Vatican. And he was fascinated because we're talking about 75, 6, 7. We're talking about the Ostpolitik, the politics with Eastern Europe, with communist Europe at the time. And so I met some really interesting, wonderful people because of accompanying him on an interview. Now, very often we'd interview someone from Secretary of State who did have English as a second tongue. So Joan was there. Al could speak one-on-one with this person, but I still learned an awful lot.
They must have found you very trustworthy as well, because like you said, at this time of, communists in the East, and there's just this secrecy between the East and the West, and the church somewhat in the middle, and I know it was a famous listening post for lots of countries, and their ambassadors having spies and stuff, but you're very much in the center of this with the New York Times. hearing a lot of things, seeing a lot of things.
And the New York Times, just to say the New York Times, when I would make a phone call to somebody, you know, for Al, just to say the New York Times opened every single door that you wanted open.
Very much a privileged position.
Oh, absolutely.
And then I know, to jump forward a bit, like we hear so much today, cutbacks at the New York Times, and your job after a couple of years, 2 years was?
Yeah, only about 2.5 years at the time. But I do want to tell you one story which talks about Al's trust in me. And he called me into his office one day, and it was a day or two after Easter of that year. So it would have been 76 or probably 77. He called me in his office and he said, Joan, I am hearing reports that this would have been Pope Paul VI, that Pope Paul VI had a mini stroke on the altar on Holy Thursday evening. And he said, I'm not even going to go with that story. He said, unless I can get confirmation, would you be willing to go to Cardinal Wright? And I said, yes. And I said, all he has to do is say, I can't tell you, you know. And interestingly enough, and this will tell you a lot about the New York Times at the time, I have this conversation. The Cardinal totally understands why I'm there. He said, yes, I was at the altar. There was a mini stroke. I think it's called a TIA or something. A mini stroke. He said, you know, but he's fine. We proceeded with the Mass. He said, however, Joan, you didn't get that from me. Okay. So I went back and repeated the entire thing verbatim to Al. And you know what? He did not go with that story.
Wow.
He had the proof, but he couldn't quote someone. And I guess then you weren't going, you know, an anonymous source. So that to me was a huge highlight of the respectability.
Because for a paper like that, a powerful story,
absolutely,
a good headline to say the Pope has a mini stroke, continues with the Mass, and you had someone at that height confirming it, but it wouldn't go on the record, so it didn't go to print. That's incredible. So when the New York Times let you go and lots of other people go...
Oh yeah, all the media in Rome was downsizing.
Yes. The next step then was working for the Vatican itself.
I wrote stories that wouldn't have a deadline on them. I'd profile the Swiss guards. Yeah, something, sure.
Things that were more evergreen.
Oh yeah,
that they could use.
And then I would actually mail those, or wherever I did have a fax possible. I'd mail those stories in, and I ended up being the correspondent for 3 or 4 different, and they would call me and, Joan, can you do a story on XYZ? And then the Register was one of the papers that, you know, Joan, we'd love you to do some stories. And so I wrote for the Register for many years, and those were stories that I would, the deadline, the paper would go to bed on a Tuesday, and I would phone in and dictate my stories.
I remember
on a Monday.
Tell me about that before, that you would be on the phone and you'd be spelling it out, and they would be typing your story on the other end. Put a comma there.
Oh, sure.
Now, this is the new line, read that back to me.
Yeah, quotation marks and spelling out names, and it was amazing.
So I know a difficult life to be a freelance print journalist especially, but an excitement to it as well, because it's an adventure. You've got a great story and you send it out to different editors, who's going to bite, and were you enjoying it?
I loved it. I have always loved a challenge, and I think something that probably anybody watching us, or a lot of people watching us on Joan's Rome and listening to me on the radio, reading my blog, they all know about my PhD, okay? And I tell people that I got my PhD at a very young age, probably more my dad even than my mom, but PhD is passion, hard work, and dreams. And if you really want to go through life, you have to have your own PhD.
I love that PhD.
It carried me through. It has to this day.
And the passion and the hard work, of course, you have that in abundance and still do. And the dreams part, when you were here living in Rome and your dream was to be involved with the church in some way and working for the church, other things did you dream about, like a husband or a family?
Well, I just assumed when I grew up that, because that was my generation, our dream. Oh, I'd go to college, but then I'd meet some fella at Notre Dame, and I'd do what my mom and dad did. You know, they got married. I had 16 aunts and uncles, tons of cousins, great family lives, fun getting together, great senses of humor. And I just had presumed that that is what my life would be. And on one occasion, I actually came very, very close. It ended up being actually a devastating experience, but actually with faith, family, and friends, I got through that. And when I could kind of, see through the clouds, I realized, because I said to God one day, and I've never said to God, why me? In bad moments or car accidents or whatever. But I do remember after this devastating experience, looking up to the sky. For some reason, God's always up there. He's never in the chair next to us at dinner, looking up and saying, okay, God, my life is in your hands. And it's like he was waiting for that moment. I could almost hear him laugh. And the next thing the next thing you know, I'm working at the Vatican. And those were amazing, fulfilling years. I could write a couple of books.
And this optimism that you have, that you become famous for as well, the joy that comes from you and the light. So you think that strength comes from God after those moments, like the marriage that almost was, but it didn't go through. That I'm sure for so many people would have a devastating effect on them for years, kind of a cloud. But you managed to push on.
There's always the sun's going to rise the next day. There is a next day. And I am sure that, and people listening, watching this, will think back for a moment to some problem that they've had. Yeah, but you can't do it alone. So, faith is a hugely important thing for me. I know I can turn to Mary, I can turn to Joseph. I have a newfound love after the year of St. Joseph. But you also count on human beings being around you. And I've just been surrounded by wonderful, loving, caring people. And that's what I hope to be to them. I love life. I love being with people. I love being active, doing things, discovering things. I met a family yesterday at Home Baked for brunch. And they were a family I've met once or twice there. They offered me brunch. So we chatted as the kids were leaving. I'm going to say the kids were probably 3 and 5. And the father was saying how much one of the boys loves to read. And I said, oh my gosh, reading is so important. And I said, you know what? One thing you have to do in life, you can never go to bed at night without learning something new that day. And I said, your mom and dad can ask you every night, what did you learn today? You know what the little boy asked me? What did I learn yesterday? Beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
And what was your answer?
And I told him actually it was something about our parish, which I had learned preparing for the 100th anniversary, and about an order of nuns. But in any event, so he caught on to that very quickly. But I
Smart kid.
I don't want to go to bed with that day having been the same identical day as the previous one.
I don't think anyone could ever accuse you of having same old monotonous days, Joan.
Right.
But let's skip ahead a bit, because I want to ask you about that learning every day and learning stuff in general, because you got a job in the Vatican eventually. What was your role in the Vatican?
I was the English language editor and writer for the Vatican Information Service, which was an office created by John Paul in 1989. And actually, when the personnel, the whole story came together in late 1990. I had moved here in September of 90. I had been in America, moved back in September. And the idea was for this to be kind of a Vatican wire service, because bishops around the world were getting their news. If it was local paper, you're always going to have some kind of a spin on it.
Yeah.
The Osservatore Romano might arrive after a week or a month, where they lived. So they wanted immediate news. If the Pope has an audience Wednesday, they wanted the news Wednesday. And so we did that with fax, actually.
Wow. And this is what has evolved into Vatican media, you could say,
sure.
today.
Yeah.
And your parents must have been so proud back home. Joan is working at the Vatican.
Oh, the newspapers did a big story, and Joan, a local woman called to the Vatican for a job, et cetera, et cetera. And my parents were moved almost more than anything else.
Now, I know I've heard people say before who are very devout, serious Catholics, that sometimes coming to the Vatican can strengthen their faith.
Yeah.
Sometimes they see things...
Or destroy it.
Or destroys their faith, or makes them question. You were seeing everything from working for the New York Times and a freelance journalist, then working inside the walls of Vatican
and meeting,
City.
You know, Pope John Paul, because I first began working at the Vatican when he was Pope, and I mean, of the 15 years that he was Pope when I was there, and I met him 16, 17, wow. 18 times. So I mean, but it was always a privilege. It was always a moment of great awe. Part of our job, of course, was getting the daily news every day. We'd get the Holy Father's speech of this group or that group, or we would also get information from the various dicasteries, their activity. But it was reading, because I'd have to write a summary of the Pope's speech to the Girl Scouts of Peru. And we had to take a 5-page speech and summarize it in 400 or 500 words. But I learned so much about my faith. I worked with about 4 different languages. And reading, I could read obviously English, Spanish, English, Italian, and French, and translate those into English. But I learned so much about the faith, or just a different way of seeing an article of faith, or understanding of virtue. And that was wonderful.
And what a unique position of responsibility to be in too, Joan, because, for the rank and file ordinary Catholic around the world who are not reading the in-depth full speeches, normally papal speeches, they turn to those summaries, right, which was your job to condense the message of the Pope while not changing the message of the Pope.
Oh, never, exactly. And it was never Joan's message or the Vatican Information Services message. But what we did learn, and this permeated every word that I wrote, we did learn that the only official voice of the Holy See was the press office. It was not the Osservatore Romano, it wasn't television, it wasn't radio. The official voice was the press office. So believe me, before we hit that send message, that's what I do today.
Yeah.
I just have different ways of doing it, and that's one of the major changes in the 40 years I've been in Rome, of course, are the ways of communicating.
Yeah, because in journalism, the change of one word can change a whole tone of a piece and feeling of a piece and message. I
had that happen once in a speech that John Paul gave on, he was talking about, it was to the Academy of Science, and there was a word which, if you used this word in English, it would have one meaning, and if you used this word in French, and I kept rereading the text to understand where he was going. And I chose the one English word, and interestingly enough, that same afternoon, the Vatican Osservatory, the Osservatore Romano, the Vatican paper, came out with the other word.
Okay.
And in the long run, our choice at Vis was the right one.
Wow.
It came out that way. 15 years.
15 years.
You know what? We only ever had to write 2 corrections.
Wow. That's an impressive feat.
I wouldn't let anything go out.
Yeah.
There were times I don't think my colleagues were happy, but I wouldn't let anything go out if we had a question. Yeah.
Because sometimes there is a push like, we're not certain about this, but we have a deadline. Guys, we have to get it out.
Oh, yeah, no way.
But you would hold
We would be a half an hour later than normal,
wow,
but it was going to go out correct. So.
But back to the question of people's faith being strengthened or weakened when they start to see the inner workings of the Church. When you were inside Vatican City, inside the walls of the Vatican, and you were seeing things that most Catholics do not get to see and hear, good, bad, and indifferent. Did it strengthen your faith in the institution of the Catholic Church? Did it make you question sometimes?
I have to say, I was blessed to know some and work with and get to know some of the most wonderful priests and nuns and lay people. I always was strengthened by their goodness, by their dedication, even by their sacrifice. Working for the Vatican, you have people with 4 and 5 languages, and even lay people in the outside world, what they could have earned, with 4 or 5 languages, with their knowledge. But I just was always blessed. I had how many dinner parties at that table right over there where they'd all be friends from different dicasteries in the Vatican. I can't tell you the conversation.
If the walls could speak.
Oh, yes. If I ever wrote a book on my dinner parties, that's what the title would be, If the Walls Could Speak. But I really knew good people. People never seemed to bring to me, including at the dining room table, negatives. Some of the negatives that have come out now are financial scandals and obviously abuse, hello. None of that, that kind of broke loose in 2002, obviously, in Boston. But again, I know people can be weak and leaders can be weak because they're people. So I'm not going to lose my faith in an institution because of one or two people who've gone astray or done something even horrendous. I just can't. I have to help build it up. I have to restore faith. And I remember when I did leave the Vatican, somebody said to me, Joan, does the Vatican realize they have lost their #1 PR person? You are so positive. You so love the church. You so love people. And you bring that goodness to us. You make us aware. And this was a Monsignor telling me, you make us aware of this is how we have to be. We have this ministry. We have to be apostles in whatever we do.
And it's joyful, and it's good. When you did leave the Vatican, you were 65 years of age?
The day I turned 65.
But that was a difficult time for you, wasn't it? Leaving the Vatican when you would have wanted to have stayed on longer.
Oh, absolutely. But it's like, again, I knew the sun was going to rise the next morning. There was going to be a new day. And I had to do something. I felt, and I don't say this egotistically, I just felt I had enough to offer.
Of course.
I had the linguistic talent. I had the background, the knowledge, the friends. Why should it go to waste? And that's when I had done a lot of things over the years for EWTN. And
often in the case of these things, it comes down to the bottom line and numbers when maybe sometimes managers don't see, well, hang on, what can we not quantify by numbers and savings and this and that, like what Joan has given us and still has to offer to the Vatican. And but as they say, one person's loss is another person's massive, huge gain, and not just for EWTN, but then for viewers and listeners across the globe who are now your fans and who have got to know you over the years. So you'd been doing work for EWTN, so it was a natural progression almost.
I remember when EWTN was in Rome, I had been in this apartment just a couple of months for when John Paul died for his funeral. And Raymond and Father Richard John, they were here one night just for drinks, and I didn't have half of what you see now. And then right down the hall is our 3 rooms, one of which is my office. But I remember saying to them, and I'm still employed by the Vatican, right?
Yes.
I remember saying, well, if EWTN ever opens an office in Rome, right down this hall is the space, And so after the conclave and Joan's retirement, EWTN opened an office in Rome, and
they came a knocking.
Yeah, they knocked, and here I am. I answered, Lord and EWTN.
Did you ever meet Mother Angelica?
Several times, yes. The very day I signed my contract in Alabama, Doug took me to the shrine at Hansville, and I had never seen the shrine. And interestingly enough, she was there that day. She had her stroke, of course, but we were down in the lower crypt chapel area, and Mother Angelica was in a wheelchair with 2 nuns on her side. We went over. Doug said, Mother, you've had a dream for many years, opening a Rome office. We're doing that, and we want you to meet your Rome bureau chief. And so what I did, I kind of knelt down so we would be on the same level. And she took my hands and held them with one of hers, and with the others, she blessed my eyes, my ears, and my mouth.
Wow.
Doug and I both think we heard her say, God bless, whether we wanted to or she actually was able to. So that was my first encounter, and then others, 2 others I think it was after, when I'd go back for the family celebrations.
You mentioned the various popes that you worked with or close to or met,
Yeah.
And different memories, different popes of
Yeah.
course, different priorities. But you never let that get into your writings. That's one thing people always notice about you. You didn't get into the politics,
Oh, no.
or how the church is leaning left or it's leaning right.
Yeah.
Was that a conscious decision that you were going to just stay out of that?
Well, I see the truth at the center, so I'm not looking left or right, whatever the truth is of that story. If there ever was any kind of political moments, it certainly, for example, John Paul's visits to his native Poland, and the coming down of the wall, I mean, he lived communism, he lived politics, and so how could that not be part of what he would bring to, the Polish people, and then bring back to Rome? His trip in 1979, Pentecost. I mean, a year later, you had Solidarność, and then, of course, a few years after that, the fall of the wall. So, but that would come into coverage of a story.
Yes, but your opinion would never come into it.
Oh, no.
Your opinion on one pope or another, or
no.
Yeah.
No, you would never know if somebody was my favorite or I was having trouble with somebody. They're the Holy Father. This is what they said. This is what I'm covering, and it was easy certainly with John Paul and Benedict. There was a huge clarity to their teaching. Both of them were capable of off-the-cuff remarks,
yes.
Obviously, which would be brilliant. Whenever Benedict went off the cuff, like in an audience, general audience, he'd have his speech and he'd put it down on his knees. He had just found a better way to say something that he had just read.
I understand.
So there was a huge clarity, and they were easy to follow.
Today you are still covering, of course, papal stories and papal events,
yeah.
And your segments continue on TV and radio. What is it like for you working now in this pontificate?
Covering events is fairly easy until sometimes Pope Francis decides to ad lib and speak off the cuff. And all of a sudden you might hear something and it's like, what did he just say? So then you want to go back and find out that you heard what he said correctly, and then you might have to give some background to something. Yeah. If it sounds like he's just, landed the plane, but then he went off the runway. So you want to...
And I understand, but when you were with the reporting on the other popes, you said, okay, they would ad-lib, but there was clarity. So as a journalist, it was easy for you to relay what they were saying, even if it was ad-lib. Whereas sometimes if the ad-libbing, you're trying to, I want to portray this in a fair way, but I need to understand first what the message here is or what's being said.
Yeah, and so, I mean, if it sounds like the Pope has just changed the church thinking on a certain matter, I want to be clear on that. I will report what he will have said, but then later, people are going to be, they're going to be writing on Facebook, they're going to write you emails, Joan, what did the Pope say?
What did he mean?
What did he mean?
Yeah.
But, to be clear, because I have a radio show on Wednesdays with Teresa Tomeo, Catholic Connection. And one day the Holy Father came out with something, I don't remember what it was, and but one of those things where you sat up and went, what?
Yeah.
And I said to her before we went on the air, I said, Teresa, we can't say what he meant to say.
Because we don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
He didn't call me at breakfast and say, by the way, Joan,
Yeah.
So we can only say based on church teaching or based on the Pope's past remarks.
When we look back, Joan, at almost, just shy of 40 years, 39 years, I think, in and out of Rome, connected with Rome and the Vatican.
Actually, 40 and
years.
a couple of months.
And a couple more, okay. Any regrets?
Not a one.
Not a one?
Not a one. I think the only regret would be, this is something I'd love to be doing for 20 more years. Of course, God had better be at my side for 20 more years because I'm not 40.
But can I ask you a rude question and ask what age you are today?
81 and a half.
You do not
Yeah.
look 81.
I know, and I don't feel it.
You don't
That's
feel
the whole
81,
thing.
yeah. I saw a speech you did once and you said, I just came from a World Youth Day. I forget which one it was. And you said, I feel like I'm 26 inside.
Oh, well, that's the whole thing. And I think it was Barbara Bush who said one time when she was 75 or something, and she said, there's a 30-year-old trying to get out of me, you know. And that's what it's like, because I am an enthusiastic person who loves life. Oh, you have moments when you're tired or frustrated. Not too many, but, you know, they're there.
You, of course, renowned for your journalism work, your personality on all your different segments on TV and radio. But you've said this to me before when we've met, that you feel you've been trying to do the work of God first, before journalism and everything else. Is that what you've felt your mission has been here?
And that's how I looked at, I mean, after that experience I had, where that was the turning point, that God knew what he was doing. I just didn't quite know at that time. And I let some time go by, and then I realized he was talking to me through the people that he sent and events people he sent into my life, events he created in my life, moments. And so I thought, okay, I never did become the nun, the sister that I had thought I might have a vocation for. God sees a vocation. And even if I would have wanted a husband and children and grandchildren, oh my gosh, the family I have today is enormous. When I think about the people I've been on Vatican delegations, you know, we went to China, Beijing, that's a whole nother thing. Wow, beautiful. So we went to China, Copenhagen, Cairo, Istanbul, and I've experienced the universal church. That was so exciting to me. And being part of the delegation.
It's an impossible question to answer, but I'll ask you it anyway, Joan. If someone asked you to look back at the 4 decades and said, pick a highlight, pick one highlight, what would it be?
Wow. Definitely events associated with John Paul. A life that I watched about and end, then the conclave, but the hope that's there because you're going to have a peaceful succession to another pope. So my one thing would have to be a life, the span, the death, the resurrection of the office in a new pope. But John Paul was shot in St. Peter's Square. I was there, so.
1981.
Yeah, May 13, 1981. Oh, yeah.
What I was surprised at before we did this interview was that the people I would mention it to, of course, they all said, we love Joan, I've been watching her. But I was surprised even young people in their 20s were aware of you and knew of your work and so on and so forth. Young people finding it harder now to keep the faith. What would you say to the next generation of people, why it's important, why you have found it important to keep your faith throughout your life?
Follow your heart. Your heart is going to have the big element of faith in it. Follow it. Listen to the voice of God. Don't listen to the voice of others. And just try really not to be swayed. Know he's with you. Know if you have the name of a saint, pray to that saint. There's plenty of people who love you and know you and want you to be with them and be good.
Joan Lewis, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you about just a tiny fraction of your illustrious and incredible and holy career. And thank you for having us here in your home.
Well, anytime you want to come to my home, and next time's going to be for a meal, okay?
Okay, it's a deal.
My table is always set.
Thank you, Joan.
Sure.